So without further ado, continuous oceans, I'll try and speak about three themes. The first is this, which looks at some of the historiography. The second theme, to kind of look at some of the terms that we might use in the study of memory, heritage, and mobility in the Indian Ocean. And third, to think about what does it mean to do scholarship in a time of ecological urgency, such as we are in. So the first theme really began with a very personal query coming from Kerala, which is on the southwestern coast of India. It was the puzzle of how the sea did not figure in Kerala's imaginaire, literary, cinematic, and so on. So I initially began with the proposition of Borges that there are no camels in the Quran, in the sense that something that is so there need not be mentioned. But it became clearer to me over the years as I studied that this was, in some sense, a symptom of what Suvendrini Pereira has called the insular imagination, writing about Australia, how in Australia the sea becomes the beach and surfing and bronzed bodies and so on, and less of the history of the coming of the white convicts and the genocide of the local people. And she raises the question in her book, what if the ground beneath our sea, oh God, what if the ground beneath our feet turns out to be the sea, right? And that's the question, that unsettling question of terra infirma is what I'd like to put before you. And while we are largely aware that 70% of the world is water, one of the things that came home to us when that ship went and stuck itself aslant in the Suez Canal was that 90% of the world's trade travels through the ocean. This is a figure that not many people were aware of, that we are in some sense dependent on the sea, on these continuous oceans for our very sustenance. And this is something that we need to keep in mind. And Lale Khalili's wonderful book has reminded us of this, of container shipping, of container ports, so the earlier port cities that we knew about, exotic Malacca, Kozhikode, and so on. Now you have container port cities in special economic zones. But the most important factor that we need to remember is that even as we talk about Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, etc., as areas, these are merely heuristic in many senses, that what we are talking about is a continuous body of water, right? And we are talking about these acts of hubris in which we name particular segments, either out of intellectual lethargy, where we want to choose smaller areas to study, or out of the fact that we, while escaping national boundaries, we still are drawn back into the arguments about area studies and smaller geographical units and so on. So Renisa Mawani's wonderful book, which came out in 2018, was the first to actually raise the problem of bringing the oceans into conversation, because she asked, what does it mean, indeed, to talk about the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Ocean as being distinct bodies of water, when there is actually a huge passage of people, ideas, and material through this. And she tells us the story of continuous oceans through the ship Komagata Maru, and a kind of proto-nationalist Gurdit Singh, who raises the fundamental question at a time as the world is shutting down to migration and a white presence on the ocean is coming up as a specter when national boundaries are closing. Gurdit Singh raises the question of this ocean being nobody's fathers, which you can imagine is a very plangent observation in Punjabi. Ye Sagar kisi ke baap ka nahi hai. So what he does then is that he starts the Guru Nanak Steamship Navigation Company, which takes Indian migrants eastwards through the Pacific to Canada. And there's a whole story there, right? So instead of the westward travel through the Atlantic, he takes the eastern route. But for him, there is only a continuous body of water, which belongs to nobody, which should allow for the migration of subalterns, which should allow the movement of brown bodies, even as the white line is being drawn through the world. A lot of recent work has alerted us to fluid geographies, and some of the people who have done this kind of work are with us today, Pedro Machado, Nidhi Mahajan, and others. But we also have the work by Sunil Amrit, Fahad Bishara, Jatin Dua, where the idea really is that if you look at Sunil Amrit's book on the Bay of Bengal, that the geographical region of Bengal becomes one unit in a vast space of water. So it is the ocean that determines geographies, where Bengal becomes just one node in the movement of people all the way through Southeast Asia into North Asia and along the southwestern coast of India. And similarly, when you look at Fahad Bishara's work, he looks at the connections across the Indian Ocean, looking at archival work on colonial legislation, colonial judicial decisions, how precedents set in Bombay High Court travel across the water to Africa, and so on. So what we are actually talking about is something that is in many senses stays within, to some extent, the carapace of empire and nation, but also exceeds it. And this becomes very, very clear indeed in the work of Jeremy Prestholt and Thomas McDowell, where they draw on the connections between slavery, African consumer demand for cloth, early American industrialization in Massachusetts, and Gujarati capital, right? So in one sense, the African consumer demand is what drives industrialization both in Bombay as well as in Massachusetts. So here again, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to study the Indian Ocean as some kind of entity when there are these flows that are happening across the waters? And if we are to move away from area studies, national histories, or indeed ecological niches with which somebody like K.N. Chaudhary or the work on the Indian Ocean suggests that there is a monsoon space, the space of the monsoon winds. The Indian Ocean is determined by this ecological niche. We have to think much beyond this once we begin to actually look at these historical movements. And what remains true is that if we are to escape from these this nominalism of Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, and so on, just as much as Jim Scott argued that civilizations cannot climb hills in the art of not being governed, similarly, civilizations cannot control oceans. So we have the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope drew an arbitrary line and said, to the east, you have Spain, and to the west, you have Portugal, and that's how the world was divided. We can no longer think in these hubristic terms, and we need to work with the movement of people and a more subaltern history of the ocean, perhaps, a history of the ocean that engages with flows of capital, a history of the ocean that engages with actual flows of people, ideas, and material. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that this is not a, we mustn't engage, as Alexander Kolas and Campling have written in their Capitalism and the Sea, the most recent book, where they argue that we must not engage in liquid fantasies of seamless flows. The ocean, even as civilizations cannot control the ocean is a space with its own restrictions, whether it is geographical, climatic, what happens in ports, maritime law. We have to keep in mind the multiple frictions that Anna Singh is reminded of. So that's the first part of my lecture. The second part of my lecture, I'll just put before you certain terms that have come to be used, which allow us to think with continuous oceans, rather than with these pockets that we are used to thinking with. So the first, of course, is the new book by Kolas and Campling on the capitalism in the sea, where they put their finger on what they call the terra-aqueous predicament, that we are caught somewhere between terra and aqua, that this predicament of how we are to engage with the fact that land and water are in a very dynamic and fluid relationship. And this is a construct, a conception that we had earlier in Kamau Brathwaite as well, when he spoke about tidialectics, the constant dialectic of land and water. You have this coming up in Edouard Glissant in the Poetics of Relation and what he calls the archipelagic imagination, where it's not mere contiguity that matters, but the imagination of affinity across multiple spaces, across islands, as it were, spaces that are connected not only by the imaginary of connection, but also by the actual flows that we've been talking about. And more recently, as George spoke about, my distinguished colleague at WITS, Isabel Hoffmeyer's forthcoming book on hydrocolonialism, which is a kind of riff on the idea of post-colonialism, thinking about various ways of colonization, the colonization by way of water, the colonization of water, the presence of ships, to use Marcus Rediker's idea of hierarchies, ships forming entities in themselves, the whole strings of penal colonies that Claire Anderson has written about so wonderfully, places like Penang and so on and so forth. So what we're talking about here is again a space that extends across the world of the water and is not restricted to any particular ocean. But all of this is very well. And for historians, we are quite used to all of these ideas. What we would suggest is a shifting of the archives. We might say we need to look at more archives, and we can look at it as a kind of incremental academic exercise. But I think a recent shift away has asked us to be slightly more daring than this, where we are actually asked to get our feet and our bodies wet in the water rather than stand like frogs around the pond, as Plato put it in Phaedrus. So how does one get one's feet wet? And Melody Jo's wonderful book, Wild Blue Media, where she learns deep sea diving in order to engage with the water that she's studying, where she raises the question of wet archives as opposed to the dry archives that all of us work with. What does it mean to know the water? As if you go back to that wonderful classic text of Rachel Carson's, where she asks who has known the ocean. There's a very poetic description where the idea that most historians don't really know the ocean. Very few of them have been at sea. Nidhi and Jatin and I have always had these conversations of what does it mean to be at sea, because I know I have a very weak stomach. I wouldn't be able to stand more than 5 minutes out at sea, much though I might marvel at the wonders of storms and so on and so forth. So Melody Jo's Wild Blue Media asks us what would it mean to actually engage with the sea in a physical sense and to engage with the particular ecologies of the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean and so on. Philip Steinberg uses the phrase wet ontologies for engaging with the ocean, where one begins to engage with the salinity, the acidity of the water, the microbes, the waves, all of these things which we take for granted as historians. There is land, there is a water, there is a ship, there is a point of transit between A and B, and we are content with that. And for various reasons, I don't know how to swim. But then neither did many 18th century sailors. In fact, one of the conditions for joining the British Navy was that you shouldn't know how to swim, because otherwise you would just jump overboard and get back home in a hurry, right? So this question of who has known the ocean. And my final point, because I have around 9 minutes left right now, I must beg your pardon for hurrying through this. 10 minutes is a short time for people like us who come from dilatory civilizations with 5,000 years of existence and so on. So finally, the time of ecological urgency. We are right now in a time of ecological urgency, and I had sent George some of the writings that I've been doing and engaging with artwork on the end of the world, artwork on global warming. And I've been closely associated with the Kochi Biennale in actually trying to work with some of these ideas of global warming and art. So the 3 points that I'd like to make here, one of the most profound works for me has been that of the Swiss artist Mari Velarde, who has a wonderful work called Atlas des Îles Perdues, the Atlas of Lost Islands, 2107. And what it is a room full of sketches of islands, some of which exist, some of which will vanish, and some of which have already vanished. But by 2107, none of them will exist. So in one view, we are seeing the world, past, present, and future. So in that sense, when we talk about global warming, it won't be the biblical, the fire next time, it will be the water next time. And we're already standing in water up to our neck in places like Jakarta and so on. But apart from this larger question, which I shan't enter into here, we also have to think about islands like Diego Garcia and Cayman Islands, which have become sites of financial and political power. We have to think about Guantanamo, which was used to house Haitian refugees in the 1980s, and then became the site of American iniquity following the war on terror. And so we are also thinking about the detritus and the continuity of Cold War phenomena in the ocean, what Ann Stoler has called imperial durabilities, which then raises the question for us, what does it mean indeed to speak about the post-colonial when we live? For many of these people who are in these islands, they live in colonial times or in neo-colonial times. Jonathan Pugh recently, in a book that came out this year on islands, has spoken about islands as a contemporary condition. We had this distinction in our mind between continents and water, But with global warming, the rising of the waters, we are indeed all islands. And the water can actually rise up beyond our shorelines and engulf us. And so this thinking from continents to islands is something that we need to think about, which introduces a sense of urgency into the way we think about the water, not in any sectional way, such as Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and so on and so forth. When the water rises up to our neck, we're not going to ask, oh, where does this water come from? Right? It's going to be water around us. And one of the things that we need to think about is also this financial question, this idea that China may will, in a wonderful essay called Floating Utopias, spoke about, where there are large numbers of the super rich who are imagining these spaces out in the ocean, which will be tax-free havens, floating ships, where 40,000 families can live, along with cinema halls and malls and so on and so forth. So these floating utopias, the island as a metaphor in a sinking world, is something that we need to think about very crucially. I'm sorry, have I gone on to 15 minutes already? How long have I gone on? Have been speaking for?
Yeah, Dilip, probably if you can wrap up in the next.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'll wrap up with the last point, and I do apologize for going on. My last point, I had one more, but I'll leave that for the moment, is that what we are, the other exigent question that we need to think about is this question of refugees. Right? Eric Lindner is in a book that came out last year called Flight Across the Sea, looks at the fact that the ocean has been the space for flight for both people from Vietnam right through to Syrians and North Africans across the Mediterranean to Europe, the Rohingyas in the Indian Ocean. There have been 22,000 deaths in the Mediterranean since 2014. And the flip side of it is, of course, this represents only 2%, right? So 98% of the cases have been successful. So when we think about the ocean around us and of continuous waters, we have to think with the imagination of the subaltern, for whom the water is not an obstacle, the water is a space for freedom, and the water is not restricted. When the Sri Lankans made their way from the civil war in the 1980s across the oceans and landed up in Canada, they weren't really thinking about these distinctions between oceans. So I'll stop here, and I do apologize for having gone on for over my time.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Dilip, for really setting the stage, as it were. I think you've kind of raised such a number of issues, from really methodological questions about how do we actually wade into the water, as it were, to these substantive political concerns that really should inform the way we think about the future. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much, Dilip. Um, um, Robert, are you able to take?
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah,